The clock flashes 0000, midnight. A phone alarm chimes softly, marking the arrival of Elena's 21st birthday. But she doesn't hear it. She's unconscious, lying in an unfamiliar bed with Egyptian cotton sheets and silk tassels. The air smells of rosewood and expensive rain-soaked earth. A crystal chandelier hums faintly above her like a frozen star suspended in time. Her eyes open slowly, not to the tiny apartment ceiling she fell asleep under, but to carved crown molding, oil paintings, and walls whispering inherited power. For a few seconds, she believes she is dreaming. Then she sits up abruptly. Where am I? The wind outside rattles enormous French windows, framed in gold. Guards in black suits stand like unmoving statues beyond the archway. And somewhere deeper in the mansion, a piano plays one haunting note after another. Slow, deliberate, patient. Each note sounds like a countdown. Elena swings her legs off the bed, and her bare feet touch heated Italian marble. She shivers. She grabs the blanket, wraps it around her, and stares at the open archway that leads into a hallway longer than her entire life expectations. Then from the darkness between notes, footsteps arrive. Not rushed, not loud, measured, composed, predatory calm. A man appears. Black suit, no tie, hair like midnight ink, eyes colder than the chandelier above. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't need to, because the first thing he says, quietly, certainly, impossibly, is, "Happy birthday, Elena." Her breath stops. How do you know my name? He steps closer, the weight of his presence dimming the whole room. He bends slightly, enough for his voice to reach her pulse instead of just her ears. And now that you're awake, he pauses, barely breathing, like the mansion itself is holding its breath with him. You belong to me. The chandelier trembles with a passing surge of thunder. Elena doesn't know it yet, but the moment she picked up that call, the moment her voice reached him, her life ceased to be ordinary. Story begins. Elena Carter was not a girl who expected destiny. She expected deadlines, bus schedules, late-night coffee, and small celebrations. She expected rent to be paid on time and books to be alphabetized in silence, because that was her job at Brooklyn Public Library, where love stories existed only inside novels, never in her personal life. She lived alone, quiet life, safe life, until last night. The night of the wrong call, the night that pulled her into a world she didn't know existed, a dark world ruled by a man feared across New York City, known only through whispers, power, and blood-stitched loyalty. Victor Moretti, that was his name, the man on the other end of the line. But she didn't know that yet. She only knew his voice. Everything had been normal, painfully normal. Elena had spent her evening arranging the return shelves at work, checking Marissa's cupcakes, baked for her, ignoring Daniel's soft calls, her best friend, and preparing for a modest birthday breakfast next morning. At 11:45 p.m., she was wrapping a gift for herself, a small silver necklace she bought from Tiffany & Co. that she had wanted for months but could only afford now after saving. It wasn't much, but to her, it was enough. The rain outside felt louder than her heartbeat then. And the phone rang. Unknown. She answered. He spoke. She froze. He ended the call. And everything began unraveling afterward. Daniel was the human equivalent of a sunrise she couldn't look directly at. Kind, warm, protective. Everyday hero without conscious effort. But Elena did not want everyday heroes anymore. They were too obtainable, too gentle, too real. She had spent her life reading dream men in stories, and no man in reality lived up to fictional danger mixed with love. Daniel came close, though. He always showed up when she didn't reply. But last night, she didn't reply because this was not the kind of danger Daniel could hold off by sleeping on her couch. She felt it, instinctively, and the strange voice knew it too. The mansion was excessive. Not loud excessive, quiet excessive, the kind that breathes money instead of shouting it. Thick velvet curtains, rugs softer than apologies, marble that warmed your feet before you asked it to. Elena had seen mansion interiors online, curated inspiration from Pinterest pages about luxury, aesthetic, fantasy lifestyles. But this was different. This was legacy wealth. Her breath fogged faintly around her lips as she hugged the blanket tighter around her. Somewhere outside the archway, men whispered, "Is she his?" She was meant to be someone else, and yet he brought her home instead. Elena took another breath. Foolishness tried to speak in her brain, but reality smothered it. This was not normal. This was heritage, criminal aristocracy, and she was standing barefoot inside it. Victor Moretti didn't touch her yet. He didn't need to. He claimed her through information first. When Daniel's theory circled inside her mind that this man didn't choose her randomly, that someone like Victor watches a girl long before he calls her, Elena hoped it wasn't true. But when Victor said her name without her offering it, something sank deeper in her stomach, something colder than fear. I am a girl he has watched before he called me. Not pried on, not stalked, but selected. And selection before claiming meant dangerous intention.
Victor doesn't propose. He doesn't flirt. He doesn't ask. He simply narrates fate until the girl stops thinking she has a choice. And Elena was not chosen for charm. She was chosen for consequence. Consequences she didn't know attached themselves the moment she answered that call. She touched the small necklace box inside her bag, awkwardly comforting. Silver, harmless, beautiful in its timid shine. But last night, another box, a much darker inheritance, was opened already. One she couldn't shut. One she couldn't walk away from. One Victor controlled now. She didn't know it yet, but her rented destiny from Brooklyn Public Library had ended the moment Victor Moretti decided his voice needed a face, and she accidentally volunteered hers. Later, at Victor's breakfast table, she finally meets his world properly, not through terror, but through structure. A long oak dining table from the 18th century, according to the maid who served her. Elena sat stiff-backed, curious but shrinking. Victor sat at the head, posture silent and unreadable. A cupcake with candle was placed for Elena, black frosting, single flame. Victor didn't look at it. He only looked at her. He whispered, "I wish to go home." Victor leaned back slightly. His silence said no. His voice said gentler, "I don't grant impossible wishes, Elena." She swallowed. That was the moment she understood. He wasn't joking. She wasn't invited. She was taken. Not by force, but by fate, mystery, and an unknown midnight phone call. And part 1 closes on Elena's candle still burning, both a birthday symbol and a warning flare. Because the mansion gates had closed the moment she entered, and now Daniel was preparing a search, while Victor was preparing a future. A very different kind of future.
Elena's second night in the mansion felt nothing like the first. The terror was still there, but it had dulled, softened at the edges. Not because the danger had passed, but because her mind had begun rearranging itself around it, the way trauma reshapes a person to make space for survival. The extravagance of the mansion that had felt suffocating yesterday now felt strangely distant, like a world she was observing rather than experiencing. Victor hadn't spoken to her again after breakfast, and yet his silence was louder than words. He had made no attempt to restrain her physically, no locked bedroom door, no threats hissed near her cheek. He only positioned her in comfort and surrounded her in shadows. His guards watched, but never touched. The staff whispered, but never questioned. The walls caged her without apology because they didn't have to. She was still here. That was enough for everyone to understand she was claimed. But not for Elena. Daniel had been pacing his apartment the moment Part 2 ended. He was sleepless and spiraling, torn between calamity and logic. He wasn't a man connected to crime. He was a man connected to Elena. That was worse, because people like him didn't understand organized danger. They understood love-intensified desperation. He was already filing reports, making calls, slamming questions into the night like fists on Victor's oak doors. But Victor wasn't answering Daniel's calls. Victor was answering Elena's fate. Daniel opened the detective notes from his laptop, another attempt to trace the unknown number that had been calling Elena. Still untraceable, still cold, still blank. That absence of information enraged him more than a threat would have. He whispered to himself, "It wasn't random." He had said that earlier about Victor, because people like Victor do not claim by coincidence. They claim by decision, and decisions like that are made a long time before midnight calls. Victor's household staff adored stories. They saw Elena as unfolding fairy tale rather than a tragedy. They saw her emotional fragility as innocence, not trauma. They saw Victor's coldness as inevitability, not cruelty. The head maid, Angela, a stern woman with sympathetic eyes, noticed Elena walking the hallways quietly after sunset. "You're not crying tonight," Angela said softly. Elena flinched, not because of the words, but because anyone in this house knew enough about her to comment on her emotional state like they felt entitled to it. Angela added gently, "That either means you're numb or you're curious." She didn't deny it, because both were true. It was curiosity, not hope, that pushed Elena to explore the mansion. Fear paralyzes. Curiosity animates. And animation looks like choice. Elena wasn't trying to escape now. She was trying to understand. And understanding was dangerous here. Not for Victor, for her. The Moretti mansion had 3 public floors that felt like royalty without crowns. But below it were 2 underground levels not mentioned in architectural plans. Every window was French, every staircase was curved, every chandelier was imported, yet the basement had no chandeliers, no windows, only steel doors and silence, trained into obedience. Elena didn't see the basement yet. She only felt it. She felt that the house went deeper than luxury. It went downward into consequence. The mansion had its own private library. That fact startled Elena. She worked at Brooklyn Public Library, the cheapest cathedral of knowledge for people who couldn't afford fate-changing calls or Italian marble floors. Victor had a personal library too, but his was built for ownership, not reading. She walked inside it quietly, fingers brushing towering spines of leather-bound chronicles, histories of dynasties, biographies of tyrants, love stories written by poets who died unhappy. The walls smelled of time more than print. One book caught her eye, Moretti Legacy, Origin, Rise, and Expansion. She didn't open it. Books here felt weaponized. Besides, she wasn't here to study his origins yet. She was here to study his intentions. One of Victor's younger guards, Matteo,
barely 25, sharp-cheeked and watchful, noticed her staring at the aisle maps. "You're looking at this place like it's a puzzle," he said. Elena didn't turn. "It is a puzzle." Matteo smirked faintly. "Then don't solve the wrong parts first." She frowned and faced him, one of the rare moments she addressed a guard directly. "What's the wrong part?" Matteo stepped closer, lowering his voice, out of instinctive secrecy, not fear. "The part where you think knowledge gives you leverage. In this house, knowledge gives him leverage." Elena blinked. "So I'm meant to stay ignorant?" Matteo shrugged. "You're meant to stay safe. Ignorance is a side effect." She looked away. Because he was right in a terrifyingly quiet way. Emma found it ridiculous at first, then unsettling, now deliberate. The second time Victor called her, he didn't make threats. He didn't need to. He only positioned himself as the man who knew her name, knew her apartment building, knew when someone knocked on her door at midnight, knew Lydia was the woman meant for that call, and knew Elena was not Lydia, and knew timing mattered more than force. Every call had an implied demand now. "Trust me until you know better." Victor's trust was a command. Elena's trust was a surrender. One was power, one was survival, and survival always looks like surrender first. Victor prepared gifts with symbolism, not affection. He instructed a cupcake with candle and let her make a wish he wouldn't grant. He called her Little Dove, like ownership deserved pet names of softness instead of iron. He talked about safety like his guards were ambiance rather than infrastructure. He sent her buildings picture without shame because anonymity was his currency. He called mornings an expectation, not a greeting. But tonight, Elena would discover something Victor hadn't anticipated, because fear was no longer her driver. Curiosity was. The mansion corridors were quiet after staff hours. They were built for echoes, not footfalls. When Elena walked toward the deeper wing, the east corridor where guards were stationed at checkpoints but not patrolling constantly, something about her posture had shifted. She looked smaller and braver. That contradiction intrigued the guards. Territory expands even when the owner is silent, because territory trains itself into obedience. His guards didn't stop her when she walked. Not yet. Because they knew better than to interrupt a story unfolding. Even villains see fate as entertainment when it isn't about them. Deep in the eastern corridor, Elena found a door unlike the others. No gold frame, no carvings, no luxury. Just a steel security door with an electronic panel. She shouldn't have been this deep, but curiosity makes a woman walk past checkpoints when guards aren't told to watch hallways instead of rooms. She touched the panel gently. Locked. She exhaled, then whispered to herself, "I'm not meant to solve the wrong parts, right?" But fate does not respect warning labels. Daniel was not curious. He was desperate. He was tracing family records, missing women reports, cryptic messaging patterns, and archived disappearance clusters from New York City. Okay, he wasn't solving, but he was forcing patterns into appearance by pressure. The library girl's friend was becoming a detective without jurisdiction. Ironically, Elena was becoming curious inside a detective's jurisdiction she didn't consent to. Their roles had reversed. Daniel would want police. Victor would want obedience. Elena would want truth. Victor whispers inward. Truth is earned after surrender, but surrender must not be earned twice. Elena hit send. fingers trembling. "Tell me what you meant. Tell me who they are. Tell me what's coming." Victor didn't answer immediately. He was silent for 23 seconds. She knew because she counted, and counting meant anticipation had overridden panic. Then, 3 dots. Unknown. "Little dove, you're digging graves with curiosity. Turn around." She looked up. Guards at the corridor's end were already watching her, but they weren't moving because Victor didn't command to stop her. He commanded to observe her. Observation precedes claiming. Claiming precedes trust. Trust precedes truth. Truth precedes love. And love is always the last consequence. Victor had cameras. Victor had records. Victor knew names. Victor knew floor temperatures. Victor didn't need to shout, because whispers command faster than threats when fear is emotionally softened by tone. She whispered into Italian marble silence, "Basement isn't all luxury, is it?" Answer, "No." Victor replies silently from a security monitor in his own office, watching the girl he thinks he owns without touching. She's smarter than she seems. Matteo had warned, solving wrong parts first gives him leverage. Elena had stepped into the basement corridor like a symbol, not an escape. And symbols don't flee until they know names. But one name was enough now, Victor Moretti. And soon she would realize the silent corridors were not a cage. They were a test she was failing by curiosity, and failing would summon destiny's escalation. Elena texted only one thing: "You brought me here without asking, so at least grant me one truth I deserve." Victor saw the message but did not reply, not because he underestimated her, but because he was already standing outside her library window on the East Corridor balcony level, watching. His voice was no longer coming through the phone. It was coming through marble corridor silence itself, because now he didn't need the call. He needed the confrontation. As she turned away from the steel door panel, she saw a long shadow spill ahead of her, and a calm voice, not through the phone, floated behind her like fate, gently closing a hand around her pulse. "Elena." She stopped walking, slowly turned. Victor Moretti stood there, eyes unreadable, rain gold glint in them like he hadn't slept either. "You're too curious to be ignorant," he said softly. Then leaned just a slight bit closer, respectful of clean romance boundaries, but heavy with destiny. "So walk with me if you want truth. But don't ask to go home again." Elena swallowed, pulse trembling, because this time the voice wasn't a text. It was a path opening that she hadn't consented to walk into, but now she might choose it.
Elena didn't sleep that night, not because the pillows weren't soft or the room intimidating, but because for the first time since she woke up in the mansion, fear had stepped back and awareness had stepped forward. Her conversation with Victor had replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. "Walk with me if you want truth, but don't ask to go home again." It sounded like a warning, but Elena felt it was more of an invitation. A dangerous one, maybe, but real. When dawn stretched pale gold fingers across the mansion, she stood by the window watching the sun rise over a world she barely recognized. Somewhere outside the gates of the estate, Daniel was probably sleepless too, calling her name into oblivion. But here, names were currency, and Victor already owned hers. Victor's steps were quiet, almost gentle for a man feared across continents. He found her standing in the corridor before breakfast, eyes distant, posture small but firm. "You look like someone who has decided to bargain with fate," he remarked, voice calm, slightly hushed.
If fate didn't want bargaining, it wouldn't have stolen my birthday, she replied softly. Victor tilted his head just slightly, intrigued. He was used to fear, obedience, intimidation, and silence reacting to him. What he wasn't used to was someone treating him like a storm to be studied instead of avoided. Come, he said. No threats, no command, just stepping forward and expecting her to match his pace. And she did. He led her to a private dining wing not used for public guests. The long oak table was already set for two, even though he never told her they were dining together. The staff worked around Victor like shadows glide around a mountain. Angela, the head maid, served without speaking. Matteo, the guard, stood far enough to give privacy, but close enough to make privacy fictional. The mansion believed in illusion, and Victor curated it. You wanted truth, he said, eyes lifting to meet hers over porcelain. Yes, she murmured. Then first truth, he continued slowly, leaning back in his chair, posture regal in a way that made Elena feel like she was being read emotionally. The phone calls weren't about you, he admitted. Elena's heart dipped harshly into confusion. Then why am I here? Because the calls weren't random. He repeated a belief she had already whispered to herself. Then, finally answering her unspoken question with clarity that felt sharper than any knife in the basement, they were about me. Elena's breath tripped, uneven. Victor continued, voice low, but never dramatic. The drama lived in his legacy, not his tone. He didn't say more than necessary. He didn't waste words. But this time he offered words of consequence. Victor explained that about 6 months ago, his personal number started receiving calls, wrong calls. This same feminine voice on the other end, whispering, breathing, panicking, pleading for someone named Daniel to help her. He didn't know who the caller was then, but the desperation in her voice sounded like someone running through shadows without armor. Victor, being who he was, didn't block the number. He monitored it, traced it through private digital channels, realized it belonged to someone blind to the fact they were dialing danger itself by accident. That was when he saw her for the first time, not in person, not through voice, but through the data fingerprint tied to the calls. Elena Blake, 21-year-old library assistant, small life, no crime, no mafia, no legacy, and yet fate dialed his number like she was scripted into something greater than Brooklyn silence. She kept calling the wrong person, Elena muttered, heartbeat tightening. She didn't know, Victor corrected gently. That was the tragedy and the opportunity. Elena stiffened at the word, opportunity. That hurt more than danger. That felt like turning a story into a contract. Victor added, I saw someone I never should have met, calling a world she never belonged to. And so you brought me into it? She asked softly. Victor paused then, because he had no narrative that sounded noble enough yet, so he said the second truth instead. The Moretti estate wasn't built for elegance. It was retrofitted for elegance to disguise its original purpose. Beneath the marble, under the carved balustrades, behind the velvet drapes, and inside every corridor was something Elena had felt but never seen directly. A fortress built by a cruel dynasty long before romance reached its gates. Victor stood, gesturing her to join him again, walking now towards the deeper wing, but never downward yet, because he promised truth, but he chose the floor it lived on. He explained that the mansion had survived attempted raids, betrayals, family wars, and external threats for decades. The public floors, luxury, but lower levels, strategy rooms, surveillance grids, encrypted data vaults, safe chambers, old war memories stored in physical form, and above all, a rule every guard breathed without speaking. If Victor speaks softly, danger should speak softer. But Elena saw the seams now, saw that silence here was trained, not natural. Elena froze mid-step.
Are you monitoring Daniel too? I am monitoring anyone whose thread intersects mine, he said honestly. And Daniel's thread already did, because you kept calling his voice into my digital walls long before you met me physically. It was odd how Victor framed surveillance like emotional inevitability instead of violation. But Elena understood the real truth under the second truth. Victor didn't just capture her physically, he had captured her story before she entered the door. Victor led her to his office. His office wasn't cold, it was territorial warmth braided into strategy. Tall ceilings, dark mahogany panels, leather-bound books that looked decorative but stored family codes. A fireplace burning even at dawn, because ambiance is influence when power meets romance. He closed the door behind them, not locking it, not imprisoning, only equalizing the space so the truth could finally sound real rather than monitored. She sat automatically because chairs command without speech here. Victor stood by the fireplace, one arm braced against the carved stone frame, not threatening, just anchoring himself in a room built for consequences. Third truth, he said, voice lower now, emotion floating like smoke when the fire softened the air. You're not the first girl whose birthday ended inside these gates. But before Elena paled, he continued, you're the first whose story might deserve a different ending. Elena exhaled sharply. Difference, ending, deserve, ending. These were story words, not mafia words. Her pulse began bending into him, even though clean romance is built on proximity, not explicit lines. He respected distance, but not destiny. Elena asked the dangerous question anyway. So why me? Victor smiled faintly, barely a smile, but very real. You think fate chose you. Elena blinked. Didn't it? No. Victor said softly, bending history into clarity. I did. Elena stilled, lips parted, pulse thundering in her internal narration like story heroines gasp silently when destiny is confessed instead of implied. Victor explained that Mafia dynasties don't operate on coincidence, they operate on selection. He had schools, corporations, shell identities, influence in media, influence in libraries, influence in digital networks. If he wanted to claim someone random, he could claim 10,000. But he claimed Elena because, despite having no crime in her life, she carried something powerful unconsciously. A voice that reached him without fear. Not bravado, not rebellion, not seduction, only innocence that accidentally dialed a man who had never been dialed accidentally in his life. He needed no possessive urgency to make her feel claimed. He only needed narrative ownership. But curiosity isn't silenced just by admitting truth. Elena looked at the office decor now differently, like someone inspecting gilded puzzle pieces. Does the basement go deeper than the marble? Victor did not get angry. Victor did not tense. Victor admitted that there was a basement, 2 levels, not for guests, not for staff, not for curiosity, only for legacy decisions. He explained it like lore, not threat, because threats are for enemies. Lore is for chosen characters in Mafia romance narratives. The basement is for one thing, he said, then walked closer, ensuring to stay within clean proximity boundaries as promised, for debts paid in silence. Elena frowned softly. I'm a library. Debts are for borrowers, not owners. Victor sat on the edge of the desk, not aggressively, not intimately, but deliberately close enough to make words feel personal. Elena was analyzing him like a story-shaped hurricane. Victor didn't mind storms that narrate inward. He only hated storms that leave footprints outward. You think you're the borrower here. Elena finally had answers. But answers in this world were never doors out. They were keys further in.
The fourth morning at the mansion arrived wrapped in stillness. Unlike the first day where luxury felt like a threat, today luxury felt like deception, carefully upholstered over danger's skeleton. Elena sat by the massive window again, cup of untouched herbal tea steaming in her hands, staring out at the iron gates that separated her old life from her rewritten fate. She could almost imagine Daniel waiting beyond those bars, assuming she was abducted by a nameless criminal figure, when in truth she was abducted by a legacy older than his city map. The maids moved silently on the periphery, respecting her space now more than ever, because a woman who knows truth becomes a visitor even in captivity, until the next contract is signed by choice. Victor, rhythmically calm, inexcusably powerful, entered the dining hall without waiting to be noticed. He didn't surprise her this time, because surprise was for the ignorant. He sat opposite her again, dressed in a dark charcoal suit cut to precision, presence heavier than tone. "You look like someone rehearsing their escape without moving their feet," he observed. Elena lifted her gaze slowly. "I'm rehearsing survival. Escape requires hope." Victor studied her face, the way a man studies terrain before claiming it permanently. She was no longer shaking, but she was still fragile in a way that made him feel something unfamiliar, responsibility that felt close to affection without ever violating innocence. "Survival has rules here," he said, "and curiosity was the first rule you nearly broke." She didn't argue. Arguing only proves you still believe in open doors. She whispered instead, tone sincere but small, "Then teach me the rules of a world I never borrowed." Victor leaned back slightly, as if truth deserved posture more than theatrics. "First rule," he began, fingers lightly grazing the porcelain cup like irony comforts itself into softness. "You don't shout for help from a fortress. Fortresses collapse inward, not outward." She swallowed. He continued, calm, clear, legacy-driven. "Second rule, you don't question ancestry. Ancestry is a river that carries you even when you don't know swimming." Elena braced her cup tighter because rivers in Mafia worlds don't flow. They decide direction. "Does Daniel know the river is carrying him too?" she asked. Victor did not show hostility. He only revealed truth number 7 behind the 6 truths already spoken. Daniel is being protected by invisibility. You are being protected by presence. One is shield, one is contract. Elena exhaled sharply because contract was more terrifying than danger. Danger can be fought. Contracts must be unraveled. "So what does the rival syndicate want from my 21st birthday?" she asked softly. Victor tapped his finger once on the desk, not impatiently, but symbolically. "Fifth truth you haven't asked yet." She shivered, not in fear, but in the waking chill of inevitability. Victor finally unfolded the ceremonial truth he had been carrying like a sealed scroll. On a woman's 21st birthday, the rival syndicate awakens the oath claim. It doesn't involve intimacy. It involves allegiance by symbolic capture. You surrender name, blessing, or presence, and the family balance is restored. Elena stiffened. "That sounds like royalty selecting brides." Victor shook his head lightly. "Royalty selects brides. Syndicates select balance." He added, tone deliberately softened like clean romance foreshadowing without explicit romance punctuation. "It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be transactional." Elena whispered, lips barely parting, "Transactions don't steal birthdays." Victor allowed a micro smile, real this time, emotion finally flickering in a man carved to hide it. "Yes, that's why I intercepted it." His interception had bought her life at a price she hadn't agreed to pay yet. Daniel had begun assembling information that Victor had already collected months earlier. But unlike Victor, who turned information into narrative, Daniel was turning information into panic-driven strategy. He printed missing person escalation routes, turned in cloud backup security logs, destroying his own sleep to widen jurisdiction he never owned. His desperation was pure, love-driven, heroic, But heroism that is loud attracts syndicates, not rescues victims away from them. Victor was quiet because quiet men who speak truth slowly don't alert enemies unnecessarily. Daniel was loud because lovers think loudness summons fate quickly. But fate was already inside the mansion, eating breakfast with Elena. Victor told the staff subtly via silent household chain of command. Elena wanted truth. Now truth needs attire. Angela, the maid, entered Elena's room soon after, gown draped over her arms like a dream sacrificed to prophecy. The dress. Ivory silk. No cleavage or explicit shaping. Elegant, modest sleeves, lace patterns. Cinched waist but respectful of innocence. Something a woman wears when fate demands story, not intimacy. Elena touched the fabric. Is this for the oath? Angela nodded softly, respectful, but emotionally aware. Yes, but Mr. Moretti added something himself. Frown? What? Angela responded. You get a rose pinned to your name. And she showed her a brooch. A small red silk rose. Red roses are romance. Silk roses are contracts. This one was both, but clean romance wrapped in transactional symbolism.
Not because he distrusted her, but because, in this mansion, observation is foreplay to allegiance, not explicit contact. Elena didn't know cameras were story narrators too, but she felt his gaze like a storm trained into stillness. He wasn't waiting to seduce her. He was waiting to see if she walked into the ceremony like a victim or a heroine. And either posture would shape the ending he had already written but not finalized. Victor offered this after breakfast. Not kindly, not viciously, only strategically. You can call one person before the oath, he said. Only one. Elena asked softly, Daniel or my father? Victor replied with the answer of a man who had already measured emotional weight. Elena, call the voice that gives you strength, not the one that gives you collapse. She didn't realize until now that her father made her collapse by blood pressure, while Daniel made her collapse by emotion intensity. Both collapses were love-coded, but not strong enough to stand against legacy. Victor had asked her to choose strength, not affection, because affection can be weaponized in Mafia worlds. Strength cannot. She dialed Daniel. Elena! Elena! Are you safe? His tone frantic, breaking under his own emotional hurricane. She inhaled, trying to control her voice, because Victor was listening, even though he promised no interference until the ceremony officially claimed allegiance. This call would become her first attempt to speak clean romance boundaries with awareness instead of panic. I am safe, she said softly, voice steady but small, like truth spoken quietly under velvet drapes. Daniel exhaled sharply. Where are you? I've been calling police, digital tracing experts, IT forensic units. Elena cut him gently. Daniel, don't shout my location. He froze, then lowered his voice. Why? She replied with the first truth Victor had taught her. Because fortresses collapse inward, not outward. Daniel frowned audibly, confused. Elena, are you in danger or not? Yes, she said. But I also found answers he was monitoring months before he kidnapped me on my birthday. Daniel stiffened with fury. Who? But Elena didn't reveal Victor's name yet. She only revealed what would guide Daniel into her story without dragging Victor's enemies into monitors she barely understood. Daniel, if you want to help me, don't call war into my rescue. I'm standing inside a legacy, not an abduction headline. Daniel inhaled again, controlled this time. Tell me what to do. And Elena said softly, voice cracking at the edges, but never offering explicit romance dialogue, because clean romance respects tone, not exposure.
If destiny asks for allegiance, become my shield, not my enemy's shout. Daniel did not understand, but he agreed, because agreeing meant love, and love was still transactional here. He wasn't angered. He was impressed, because she followed Rule 1 without knowing Rule 8 existed. You don't reveal a syndicate man's name until allegiance is official. She had passed that unconscious test already. Victor didn't take her downward. He took her upward. Upward means observation. Downward means debt resolution. He chose upward because debt was the rival syndicate's clause. Observation was his. She walked beside him toward a marble balcony now, a state sprawling like an emotionally tinted kingdom, clouds turning rosy at sunrise like the world itself was in a story filter overlay. Guards stood like infrastructure walls, not threats. The staff drifted like atmosphere designs, not interrogators. The heated floors felt like influence. The gates felt inevitable. Victor wasn't loud, because loudness alerts enemies. Victor was quiet, because quietness alerts destiny. He said softly as they stood beside the balcony edge, rose garden blooming far below, a faint breeze moving through her hair with romance cinematic softness. Elena, the oath was meant to claim your name. I claimed your story. She frowned. Stories don't hold more value than names in a dynasty. Victor responded with calm gravity. Poor names belong to dynasties. Strong stories belong to Morettis. Elena exhaled softly, realizing the emotional bill was about to be handed ceremonially, not explicitly. He continued, Elena, you could walk into the oath and surrender to someone who demanded lineage. Or, you can walk into the oath already observed, already protected, already rewritten, already mine by narrative, not intimacy. Elena's pulse tremored again. Daniel was her lover outside. Victor was her story owner inside. But story owners don't seduce. They surround. And being surrounded felt like love, even in danger. Elena whispered, voice steadying beautifully like Nina-style protagonists do right before allegiance fiction becomes romance canon without crossing adult scene boundaries. Then let survival make us allies until destiny makes us truth sharers. Victor smiled faintly again, not victorious, not intimate, only acknowledging the heroine posture instead of victim posture. Because part 5 wasn't her surrender to debt. It was her surrender to the man who narrated her destiny without touching innocence explicitly. And innocence feels intimacy without adult scenes when narrative is possession.
Elena walked into the grand ceremonial hall of the mansion that now felt less like a palace and more like a chapter carved in marble. The doors behind her closed softly, not with a metallic echo, but with a quiet thud cushioned by power and wealth engineered into silence. She no longer measured the walls by how they trapped her, but by how they observed her. The estate, known in syndicate circles as the Casa Moretti, was older than threats and quieter than legends, but ruthless enough to rewrite destiny while letting romance bloom on its edges. Casa Moretti Victor stood ahead of the hall, illuminated by a single overhead skylight that poured silvery gold morning rays down his frame. Cinematic, composed, untouched by urgency. Elena realized that the moment had arrived where story met consequence and love met decision without needing to cross any forbidden line for intensity. The hall was decorated modestly but symbolically, white roses, candles placed high enough to glow without intimacy connotations, shared drapes flowing like fate itself exhaling, and guards lining pillars like silent period markers in a narrative he already edited for her survival. Daniel was still awake outside the gates of her former life,
but for the first time since her disappearance, his desperation had mutated into clarity. He stopped calling the police after Elena made him understand Rule 1. Don't shout location into fortresses. He sat instead on his apartment floor, maps of Brooklyn spread before him like a man ready to redraw rescue into strategy rather than war. Elena had chosen Daniel's voice, not her father's collapse, and that choice had given Daniel a new role. Not the lover who begs for return, but the lover who arms himself emotionally to stand against legacy debts. He whispered into the apartment quiet, not yelling this time, because love that survives Mafia worlds learns silence faster than freedom. If your story was rewritten, Elena, let me be the man who protects the rewrite, not attacks its author. He was still far from understanding Moretti complexity, but love never needs total understanding to evolve into shield mode. Victor's consigliere Lorenzo entered the hall from the side passage quietly, hands folded, expression unreadable but voice soaked in diplomacy, because diplomacy keeps love clean when power escalates. Miss Blake, he said gently, never demeaning, never harassing, never explicit, just marking her by surname, like one marks a visitor whose contract was intercepted but not crudely handled. The rival syndicate claim expires if Mr. Moretti publicly acknowledges your protection oath today. Lorenzo Bianchi, Elena stiffened. Acknowledges my protection or my ownership? Lorenzo looked at her calmly, eyes sympathetic but disciplined. In Mafia worlds, girl, protection and ownership share a surname until you earn first-name privileges. Elena exhaled sharply. She knew protection was being offered as attachment with modest romance rather than explicit possession. Love in these corridors was a non-adult but violently intense exchange of narrative proximity rather than forbidden scenes. Victor extended his hand toward her, not grasping, not demanding, not pulling, only raising it like a man offering alliance without ever touching her unless she chose to step forward herself. Elena observed the hand, big, scar-free palms, fingers accustomed to sealing deals, signing family codes, making power bows rather than lover bows. She placed her hand gently into his, not because romance required it, but because story required connection proof for Part 6's climax. Victor's thumb did not brush her skin. His grip was firm but respectful, no lingering intimacy, only enough contact to signal oath legitimacy in clean romance form. If Nina-style protagonists had a rule for moments like this, it would be, fate holds your pulse with authority, but love holds your pulse by stillness until permission arrives. The ceremony began without speeches, because speeches were for outsiders. Oaths were for surrounders who inherited silence better than volume. Lorenzo lit the first white candle, then stepped back, allowing Victor to stand directly beside her, not tightly, not invasively, just in the frame where romance looked cinematic instead of explicit. Elena understood candle symbolism now. Candles are clean. Flames are untraceable. Smoke rises upward, meaning legacy is not hidden when acknowledged publicly. Lorenzo spoke again with ceremonial neutrality. Let it be known that Elena Blake, age 21. Victor looked at her calmly, acknowledging surname usage only because transactions here were legal in symbolism, but emotional in gravity. Is under the vow of Casa Moretti protection. No rival claim may extend beyond this candle's flame. That was it. No priest, no cathedral, no explicit intimacy, only Victor's voice declaring non-adult but narrative canon belonging aloud for the first time. The voice was calm, not scary, not intimate, not shouted, just final, because final voices don't need effects when legacies assemble themselves in corridors by default. The guards bowed respectfully, not to love, but to authority acknowledging protection fictionally and romantically. Staff drifted with subtle smiles, because Part 6 was now a romance blooming inside a crime dynasty without violating censorship rules. Elena's lips trembled slightly, not in fear, in emotional recalibration. She whispered softly, quiet enough for Victor alone to hear. So survival made us allies, and the oath made my story official. Victor turned his head slightly toward her, eyes storm-softened at the edges now, because storm softening is allowed in clean romance, and said gently the sentence that Part 6 needed as final turning point closure without adult escalation. Then official stories don't ask to belong. They're escorted to belonging by dawn itself. Elena swallowed quietly. She realized that the oath saved her from debt, and Victor saved her from chaos. But now, Daniel would save her from losing herself to story possession she never signed explicitly. There was romance in Victor's final tone, but also inevitability. Elena didn't hate inevitability anymore. She hated identity loss. And identity loss hurts more than a vow stolen quietly. Victor had promised truth, not freedom. But truth is incomplete without conflict introduction. Elena had one more truth left to unwrap before closing her birthday wound into a new life. Victor didn't tell her he had already summoned Daniel quietly, not as enemy, but as next chapter confrontation test. She heard footsteps behind candlesmoke silence, faster, louder than Victor's, but not screaming, only emotionally charged enough to collapse staff illusions into awareness. She turned. Daniel stood there, not bound, not guarded, not arrested, only escorted by negotiation, not war. Daniel Carter. His eyes locked onto hers, expression equal parts relief and fury, not because he wanted to attack Victor, but because he wanted to reclaim Elena externally without nullifying the protection vow. He walked forward, not stopped by guards this time, because the oath made aggression illegal. Today. Elena, he whispered, breath sharp, voice broken with desperation, but finally controlled enough to stay inside clean romance boundaries. You were missing. Victor spoke beside her without turning. She was found before she disappeared. Daniel froze and looked at Victor with quiet rage, not violent aggression, because violence would violate oath legitimacy, and Daniel's silence was now battlefield ready, but not shouted. He replied with teeth clenched but voice civil, proving he had learned Rule 1 instinctively. Then she was found, but not asked if she wanted to be found. Victor finally turned then, because this was confrontation allowed in clean romance form. She was drowning in ignorance. Daniel snapped back quietly. Ignorance isn't drowning. Chosen ignorance is freedom. Victor approached him slowly, not punching, not intimidating, not invading Helena, only positioning dialogue like a chess grid releasing a capture into negotiation, and negotiation was love intimidation's legal version here. She didn't choose ignorance. Victor looked at Daniel deliberately. I chose awareness for her. Daniel inhaled sharply, and awareness stole choice from sunrise. Victor nodded calmly. Then let this sunrise return choice, since awareness already escorted her in. Daniel looked at Elena. Elena looked at Victor. Victor looked at Daniel. This wasn't a triangle of intimacy. This was a triangle of voice, ownership, protection, and love conflict negotiation. Clean, but intense. For the first time since waking in the mansion, Elena said something out loud, not inward. I want one more truth, and then I get choice without being followed by legacy or debt. Victor did not interrupt. Daniel did not interrupt.